start the class and let's get a little bit of our administrative stuff out of the way, right? You all have a test starting on the 11th, right? Or let me look at that real quick, right? Or let me look at it real quick. Make sure I'm saying the right things, but so the test window opens the 12th at 12 a.m. and will be open through the 13th. Yay, I'm glad you can hear Andrew. So you'll have 48 hours, right, to take your exam. Your exam, you're going to have an hour, I think, 30 questions, 2 minutes apiece. You'll have an hour that you'll have to use continuously to take the exam. So someday in that 2-day period, carve out a good hour and a half, whatever, to have a nice quiet test. I think there are 30, if I recall correctly. But you want a nice, clean, quiet, uninterrupted environment. Obviously, a good test environment. Do as best as you can there. And try to make sure that you've got a good, solid connection, internet connection. And make sure that you take the exam, right? Don't forget. So yeah, it is open until 11:59 p.m. on the 13th. Right, so that's going to be all of Friday, which is the 12th, and all of Saturday. So when it becomes Sunday, it's off. Okay, which is Sunday midnight, right? Okay, yeah. So absolutely right. Try to, like I said, the test lasts an hour, right? But you're probably not going to need that whole hour, right? There's 30 questions or so. So, and they're multiple choice. So, now, Davin, you don't know about Samantha's, do you? Oh, no. Okay. She has confirmed that hers are a nightmare as well. Okay. So I'm just wanting y'all to know, I will try, of course, to remember to mention again on Thursday, right? In class, hey, right, tomorrow we start on the test, so be there. So that being said, we've got one chapter to cover today and Thursday on federalism. It's a fairly short chapter, so we'll definitely get done. And if we get done early enough, I will probably just move on to chapter 4. But the test is only 1 through 3, right? So if we go past 3 and get into 4, that's not on the test you're going to take this week, okay? So any questions before I get started on federalism? All right, let's get that pulled up. All right, so federalism. All right, we got to ask ourselves first, what do we mean when we use the word? What is it? How does this work for us? And the general description or definition of federalism is really straightforward. You need to think a little bit about it, but anytime you're organizing multiple levels of government, usually a national government and then some level of government that's under that national government, right? So a nation or a state, or a state and a county, right? So anytime you have multiple levels of government that have the same, they have authority over the same area and the same people, you're going to have some federalism. Some form of federalism is going to be in existence. There's some way that's going to be organized that says, okay, national government, you have this control, and state government, you have this control. Maybe there's some area where you share control, depending upon the type of federalism we have. But federalism is going to be this practice of organizing authority between two groups or more over the same people in the same area. So you think about Texas, right? Texas, the supreme authority, governmental power in Texas, right? And over Texans is the U.S. government. Then there is the Texas state government that has authority over Texans in Texas. Then there are 254 county governments that have authority in their county, right, over Texans. And then there are city governments and special districts and other local governments, right? So we have lots of levels of government, and we share a lot of the same space and a lot of the same company, right, that's under those authorities. All right, so that's what we're going to be talking about, is how do we design this to work, that these organizations share power, share people in place and authority. Generally speaking, there are three different ways to organize this kind of federalism. We've experienced all of them in one form or fashion in Texas. So the first one, if you're looking at the United States in general, we see, well, instead of that, let me just go through the types and I'll apply them to places as we talk about them. The first form of federalism we can talk about is a form called, or type called, Unitary Federalism. The word unitary gives you a big clue here. Power is held in one place, and all the other levels of government answer to that one unitary power. So this is a national government, say, right, that is saying, okay, I've got 50 provinces, and provinces, I'm going to, as the supreme power, let you exercise power in these areas in these ways. But everything I'm going to let you do, I'm going to dictate. I hold the power. I regulate the lower governments. Y'all can only do what I say you can do. So that's one way of organizing power between governments over the same people in the same area. If we were to look at Texas, right? Texas operates in a unitary form of power over its counties. If you look at the Texas Constitution, the Texas Constitution says there will be municipalities, and these municipalities will be counties that will be created by the state government and will have the powers that the state government delegates to them. So the 254 counties we have in Texas were created by the Texas state government. The power that those counties have to operate is delegated to them from the Texas state government. They don't have any power of their own, right? This is a unitary system of federalism within the state of Texas, okay? That could happen at a national level too, right? If you go to other countries, right, there are a lot of countries out there where the federal government holds all the political power, and they'll have districts or provinces or states. And the federal government tells those states, you can do this. Here's where you can operate. But at any time, if we change our mind at the federal level, then you will change the way you do things as we change our mind, right? So it's a top-down approach to organizing government, right? And so you create multiple governments that operate over the same area, the same people, but the power is held at the top. Does that make sense? Pretty straightforward. The second type of federalism that we see out in the world is called Confederal Federalism. And this is where you flip the unitary design upside down, where the parts hold all the power and tell the top level government what it can do. And you might say, well, that seems really kind of weird. But we've done that in the United States twice, right? The original US Constitution was a Confederal Constitution. The federal government could only do the things that the 13 original states said it could do. And if you look at the name of that first Constitution, it was called the Articles of Confederation, right? And that's great if you're the lower government, the state, because you've got all the power and you work with the other states and you all agree and tell the federal government what it can do. And the federal government is limited to doing what the states allow it to do. The second time we experienced this, or at least the second time Texas experienced this, was during the Civil War, right? The Confederate States of America, right? The nation that we created when we seceded from the United States of America was a confederal system also, right? The states had the power, and through agreement between the states, they lent power to the federal government. The U.S. government found the confederal system very limiting, and the states were also not so happy with what the federal government was allowed to do. They couldn't all agree on what they wanted allowed to do, so it wasn't the most effective or efficient system. The Confederate system wasn't around long enough to see if it was ever going to be a very effective system, but it obviously disappeared within about 4 years or so when they lost the war. So those are out there, right? Those confederations happen. They can be put together. They can exist. The idea behind it, of course, is that you've got smaller groups of people that want to have some organization over the top of them, but they're a little concerned about how much power to give that unifying organization over the top of them. So they dictate to it with the confederal federalism design. Does that make sense? Right. So unitary is all power from the top down. Confederal is power distributed from the bottom up. The third type of federalism is confusing to call it this, but it is federalism, right? And it is the design that we operate under in the United States today. It is an agreement of both unilateral and shared powers between the different levels of government, right? So there's going to be places where, right, and this is what we'll spend the rest of this talking about is our federal design. It's going to be a place where the federal government has some power and the state governments have some unitary power, right, power to themselves. And in the middle, there's a lot of places where we share some power, right? Work together sometimes and get things done. Anytime you choose this federal design, right, that we use in the United States and between the states, you're choosing a design that's got a lot of moving parts. You're choosing a design that requires a lot of work, it requires a lot of coordination. You're choosing a design that you have to do a decent job of delineating roles between the different actors. The terms that we use when we talk about this are terms of decentralization, right? So the federalism that we have in the United States and in the states is one that we take politics and we spread it out between how we make decisions on politics between all of the different actors. We take policy making and we spread it out between all of the actors. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. Decentralization, right, is really important because anytime you share power, you share decision making, you share implementation of decision making, you're bringing a lot more potential confusion, arena for debate and negotiation and arguing and bargaining politics, right? You're bringing all more of that into the situation. You're probably making the system overall a little less efficient, right, when you decentralize something. And so it's kind of one of the hallmark issues with splitting power and sharing power between multiple organizations, that it's going to be probably a less efficient system. When we designed this federal system that we operate under, we knew that. This wasn't a decision made without that expectation. So when we framed our second national constitution and designed it as a federal document to share power, we knew and expected, counted on it being less efficient, right? And that was meant to ensure that there was a limitation on all of these governments, right? That they would be less efficient. So decentralization was ensuring some inefficiency in the governing process because it was making power available to more actors. It also decentralizes the development of and implementation of policy. And a lot of times this is a good thing, and a lot of times this is a questionable thing. So let's talk about that in 3 and 4, right? 3 and 4 are going to give us our description on the decentralization of policy, certainly. Generally speaking, historically speaking, the United States government has looked at the states as a place, and this is in our Constitution, right, where states have the power to kind of mold policy in particular areas, particularly in social areas, family policy areas, social mores and expectations. We expect, the federal government expects the states to play a prominent role in making policy in those areas, right? What we expect New York to do versus California to do versus Texas to do versus Florida in the same area, maybe on the same issue, will be different. We expect those state governments, right, to express the political culture of the people in that state, and that might therefore have states focused on different things and have different solutions to the same problems, right? And you can look at something like marriage policy or marijuana policy, legalization policies, and see that, right, this is varied between states and does vary between states. And that's because the federal government sees themselves as having a little bit limited jurisdiction in these areas, and the states have constitutionally a bigger area to exercise their decision-making ability and their concerns of their citizens. And so we see this vary from state to state. So we expect the states to be acting differently in those areas. We expect them to pass different policies. We expect them to have different processes in place. From the state level, this is a good thing because we can have a government closer to us that is operating off of the assumptions, beliefs, and desires that we as Texans have. And Floridians can do it their way, and Minnesotans can do it their way, and right. And we can all have a little more tailored political and process in place that matches with what we as Texans think versus what Californians think. So that's good in that sense, that we're not all trying to be exactly the same everywhere all the time. The other thing that comes out of it, though, is that as states exercise their policymaking area in these arenas, the federal government is able to kind of survey the decisions that are being made. And if it ever gets to the point that we need the federal government to make some policy in that area, well, they've been able to survey all of the states and view them as basically labs, right, laboratories for the federal government. And they can say, okay, well, right, these 6 states, right, all did something different than these 8 states and these 12 states. And so let's look at who was successful and who did what and what worked and what didn't work. And now if there's an expectation there's going to be a federal policy made in this area, we can pick the one that's already been tested down at the state level and pick the best one that works the best, is the most efficient and the most effective, and know that we've got some practical experience with it out there that shows us why this is going to work, instead of us just generating a thought experiment that this is the best way forward. And so that's a really useful tool for the federal government to pay attention to the states as policy laboratories and to look at them, because a lot of times as policy issues bubble up from the states, they eventually become a federal issue. And the states are asking, or individuals are asking, depending upon the case, for the federal government to standardize across the states. And if they have the constitutional authority to, and there's enough of a political will to, then we'll see maybe federal policy being made on that, and they can use the states as a guinea pig, basically, right? And so when we look to how the governments are going to work with each other, right, this decentralization and this splitting up of power and areas of expertise and areas of decision making between the different levels of government, it brings about some interesting perspectives and ideas. Any questions about why federalism is important and how it's important? Now, I mentioned, actually, let me back up just. I mentioned at the beginning is on number 1 that sometimes we see good things coming out of the decentralization of politics, and sometimes we see bad things. So let me give you a bad one, right? We just watched this last federal election, right? Presidential election happen. And, right, we had a period of indecision there, right? A period of where we saw the media telling us what the voting returns were from state to state to state, and then having to try to explain to us how each state went through its process of counting votes, and the processes they used to count votes differed. The timelines they used to count votes differed. Where they counted them differed. How they structured and held their elections were different from state to state. And the reason, of course, behind that is that that's one of the policies that is delegated for the states to do, right? These federal elections have been, through the Constitution, handed to the states, right? And then it says states are going to be responsible for running these things. So when we're doing that, when all of the 50 states are organizing and then their elections and then ascertaining the results of those elections, and we're wanting to know what all 50 states did and who's our president now, right? And then the answer you get, and it's the right answer, is we're not sure yet. We got to wait. We may have a week or 2 weeks, or right, depending upon the state that we're talking about, for all of this to shake out and the state to come back and say, okay, we're done. Everything's counted. All our processes were done properly. Here's our result. Right, and that's actually takes some time, and we are not a people that want to wait for those results, which is why the media is delivering, right, as states make a statistical determination of what the outcome of their elections will be, right? We're waiting for that, and the media comes on and says, okay, Arizona just declared that Biden won the presidential election in Arizona. And everybody's going, you're looking at the TV and you're looking at it and it says 20% of the precincts have reported in. And now you've got a media person telling you Biden has won. And they're like, there's 80% of them not out that we don't know yet, right? And the answer is yes and no, right? We're using statistics and we're using the laws and practices of statistics to answer questions based upon historical results, based upon knowledge that we have on the ground. And almost always we're pretty good at that, right? When we see enough come in, we can know what the result's going to be, unless something really, really outside the realms of probability happens, right? And if that does happen, something way out there, we're going to take our time to figure out what was different that made this happen. What was so weird that this didn't fall into line the way it normally does? And a lot of that is because we know a lot about the people that are voting on the ground, right? We know how many Democrats and Republicans and Independents and Libertarians and Greens there are, because in a lot of states you register belonging to the group, except for the Independents. And so we know the total number, right? And we know the breakdowns of those total numbers, and we know how many have already been reported, and we know how much is left out there. And within a 95% guarantee rate, pretty much, right, a probability, we can tell you what the results are going to be. And most of the time we're right about that. But we're used to, right, the media being able to do that and give us an answer. Here's your new president. And sometimes, right, the vote is not, we don't know that quick. And sometimes we just have to say that we need to wait. And, you know, when you're talking about 1,000, 10,000, right, votes within a state making the difference, you got to slow down and you got to look exactly at everything. And you got to follow the laws in that state about how to do it. So in that sense, the decentralization of politics and policy to each of these individual 50 states has a detrimental impact on what a lot of people think about the legitimacy of the election, right? All the other elections, you were able to tell us by midnight who the winner was going to be. And tonight you can't? Well, that's weird. Things must be going wrong, right? We must have some real problems out there. Maybe, and maybe, right, it's just the situation's a little different enough that it takes longer. That's, right, some of the possible things that occur because we've decentralized politics and stuff. Saw an article from Abbott about voter fraud in San Antonio, and they were being charged. There's always a minuscule amount of voter fraud. And usually, when you look at it, you're talking about voter fraud in the numbers of, most of the time it's actually one person, right? One person has done something fraudulently and they've caught them, and nobody, I shouldn't say that. People care. I was going to say, nobody cares about that one person doing it. We do care that fraud happened. That one person is almost never going to be causing an impact. However, it is possible, although not probable, it is possible for there to be, depending upon the process we use, maybe problems with votes or ballots, or one of the things that happens, I would say fairly routinely, is that collections of ballots get misplaced for a small amount of time. They're almost never lost, right? There's a whole extensive list of processes that go into putting ballots into a box and transferring that box from one voting place to a counting place. It's almost impossible to completely lose a box of ballots and not know it, and not know which ballots were in that box, because there's, record taking at all of these different steps. And that's one of the reasons it's so slow, right? Say you're at a polling place and people are dropping off an absentee ballot. You're a state that has said you can bring an absentee ballot in, bypass the line, and come to this drop box and put it in this box and leave. Some states allow you to do that, just drive up and stick it like in a mailbox almost, right? It's the box they put out there, it's locked. You just drive by and throw your ballot in. Mm-hmm. Some states require that when you come up that you have to come in and sign something, right? Or somebody has to see you, right, sign the ballot envelope and stick it in. Some states, right, will let you mail the ballot in, right? And they'll have a whole list of things that you have to do for that ballot to count ahead of time. You have to, on that ballot, put this amount of information, include maybe a photocopy of a photo ID. You have to provide a signature that is going to be deemed to match the signature that's on your registration card that's already in the system at the state level, right? When you're doing those kinds of checks, that slows everything down, right? I mean, so your ballot comes in, it comes mailed in, comes to the counting place. I have to make sure that when I pick up that envelope that it's still sealed, right? There's nothing that indicates that it's been tampered with. I have to record the information on the outside of that envelope. I have to open that envelope up. I have to take that ballot out, record, right, the identifying information, because each ballot is going to be unique, right? I've got to pull up electronically probably the signature that you have in the state system and compare that to the signature that I'm holding in my hand at the ballot and make sure that those are reasonably similar, right? And if they're not, then I'm going to flag this for a specialist to look at these signatures, somebody that's trained, right? It's like, oh, that's not even close. Okay, right? And that one will get flagged, and I'll record that, and I'll put that ballot in a different place than I will one that's hit all of the check marks as I was counting. So those, now I've got at least 2 boxes of ballots, right? Ones that I have questions about, ones that I think that are great. Somebody else behind me is going to look at that again and record what they're going through. So when you hear, right, loosely organized news stories about truckloads of ballots being brought in and changing everything or being lost, it's almost never going to be true, right? I mean, I'm not going to say that it can't happen, but if it does happen, there are almost always so many alarms and bells and whistles in place that the state's going to know about it fairly quickly, because they know how many ballots they sent out, who those ballots went to, what precinct they live in, right? They know they can't get back any more than they sent out. If they do, they've got a problem. They know when those ballots, right, have to have been postmarked by, right? There's just all of these little things that add up to being fairly certain about even a mail-in ballot being a good ballot or not a good ballot. Can people cheat on that and probably get one through here or there? Yeah, probably. It's certainly possible for some one person in one household, where, especially, so say we're in COVID and this household that I'm in, we have me and my wife, and we're both voters. We request 2 absentee ballots because of COVID, and they mail them to us. It's certainly possible, right, that I could take both of them, fill both of them out, maybe do a pretty decent job of forging my wife's signature and mail them back in and her never know about it and never think about it. That's certainly, I guess, possible. And if I did a really good job of it, that could probably work. The odds that someone outside this household could do that without having access to the household, not as easy. Certainly not as easy. And frankly, what's the possibility of it making a difference? Not much, right? When you're talking about 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 votes making the difference, that's a lot of this happening without it being able to be found out, right? That's to do it 10,000 times versus one time in 10,000 places, right, is a lot harder. And to do it in bulk is even more difficult. So I'm not going to ever say that it can't happen, but most of the states have pretty strict protocol about how they go about this. And the chances of it being of a big enough scope to change an election result are probably minuscule. At best, right? A percentage of a point, right? So, and that's why when we see something like, I'm not sure about the article you're talking about. So I'm not sure what Abbott's saying, if there was some kind of systemic problem. Then the fact that Abbott knows about it means that there's probably something they've got something there. If it was that small, it was small, it's probably, one, not important, but two, easily found out in the sense that, someone, like one of the cases that we had, woman voted, and she thought that she had done everything right and she was eligible to vote, and she did vote, and then she wasn't. Well, technically that's voter fraud, and probably nothing happens to a genuine mistake. If the situation like I gave you before, where I did it for my wife, was found out for some reason, that's going to get prosecuted, and it should, right? If I did that and I voted for my wife, I should be prosecuted for voter fraud. Is it a big deal in the sense of how the election turned out? No. But is it something the state should follow up on and convict on? Yeah, absolutely. If they got the information, the data that proves that happened, that should be the case. So that's a place where, right, sharing power can be, right, questionable sometimes, or at least lead to questions sometimes. When we were putting this design into the Constitution, right, we were trying to figure out a way to ensure the states that the new federal government we were building, and one that was going to have power now for itself, as opposed to in the Articles of Confederation, right, under this new Constitution, the federal government was going to have powers. And so we needed to make sure that there were some considerations given to protect the states that were now going to be under this federal government. And so one of those powers was the responsibility to conduct all the elections is given to the states. And so even as we elect presidents and we elect U.S. Congress folk, the state is controlling that process. And that's good in the sense that it ensures the state has a role in making sure that who gets elected is elected properly by state law to federal service. But it does also bring up all these other concerns, right? Second thing that was given as a protection of the state was a guarantee by the federal government that they would protect all of the state's boundaries from invasion, not just external invasion from another country, but also internal invasion from another state. So, the folks in Oklahoma can sleep well at night knowing Texas isn't going to come invade them, right? Because the federal government's probably going to be there to stop that. We haven't had much concern about that, obviously, and it's not really been a big deal for 100 years or so. But it's something that's there. The third one actually is important, though, and that's that the federal government can't change the political boundaries of the states. And that's really important because those boundaries, state boundaries, are the demarcation of the power of the state and the population of the state, which equals political power of the state. So the federal government has no authority on its own to alter the political power of a state by changing the political boundaries of a state. Now, that doesn't mean that states' boundaries can't ever change. But what it means is that if a state's boundaries are going to change, that state is going to be an equal working partner with the federal government in making those changes. So that both the federal government and the state government are going to agree to any changes that they would make to a boundary. Now, we don't see this very often, right? We see territories, right, that the government has control of. If we look back to history, we see territories and purchases of territories and territories that were ceded through treaty that brought large tracts of land, right, into the U.S. government being split up into states. We see states like Texas that had their own boundaries set by them being a nation, and then some treaties that they entered into later, boundaries being set there. We can't, so Samantha asked if we can't invade Oklahoma, but we can join forces. We can't even join politically with Oklahoma to make one state unless the feds would agree to that, right? Again, any change to the boundaries requires the federal government and the states together. Now, if Texas, Oklahoma, and the U.S. government all agreed to make Texoma, they could do that. And of course, Oklahoma would want Oklahoma-Exis or something. I don't know, right? But we could all work together and agree to do something like that, maybe. There are going to be a lot of other states going, wait just a minute. We don't necessarily want that to happen. Yeah, I don't know that we have any Oklahomans in the class. As a native Texan, right? I don't know that I would declare them weird, but they are north of the Red River, and that makes them suspect. Right? And that's being a Texan right there. That's that weird. I don't know what that means, Ruben. I'm too old to understand. So, but right. Nevertheless, we can make that happen, right? There's at one point, Texas, when we joined in 1845, we had suspicious. Yes, okay, thank you. Suspect, got it. We had in our treaty with the United States that Texas could, on its own authority, right? So this was written into the treaty when we joined the United States in 1845, that Texas could split up into 4 more states. So that was the kind of agreement that had to be in place ahead of time for something like that to happen. That's no longer in our Constitution, right? So we don't have that authority any longer. But when we came into the Union in 1845, that was Texas as a nation joining the U.S. as a nation, right, becoming a state. So we were negotiating on that treaty as equals, right? The nation of Texas and the nation of the U.S. While we were negotiating to become a state of the United States, that put us in the unique position of being able to maybe carve out some special privileges for us as a state. And for a while we had some. We don't anymore, but we still have one. We have still the authority to fly our flag, the state flag, at the same height as the U.S. flag, right? The proper protocol for all of the other states, as far as I'm aware of, is that the state flag is flown a little lower than the federal flag is flown, but Texas has the ability to fly our state flag at an equal height, right? So, and it's, again, a kind of a nod back to that history of us having been a nation. So those are some of the things, right, that we have as protections against the federal government controlling us, right? That states have as a way to preserve themselves as a power within this federalism, this federal design. So that being said, generally speaking, right, our federal government is the supreme power, right? If there's a discrepancy between what a state wants to do and a discrepancy what the federal government wants to do, unless it's in one of the carved out areas of power that belongs only to the state, the federal government is generally going to be supreme, right? In other words, its law is going to be more important and going to carry the day as far as making decisions, not the state law. And the reason for this is that in our Constitution, through the supremacy clause of the Constitution, we set up basically a hierarchy of what the most important laws are, or the base level of laws, starting from most important and then moving to others. And we set the Constitution of the United States as the basis for all the political power of both the federal government and the state governments. Right, so states have the power that the Constitution gives them. The federal government has the power the Constitution gives it, and then there's some areas in the middle where they work with each other. And so that Constitution is our first expression of how power over the same people in the same areas is divided between these levels of government. And the Constitution is federal in this sense, so it's first, foremost, and prime. Then, because the Constitution gives the U.S. Congress the ability to make national laws, right, those national laws are supreme over state laws if the two conflict, generally speaking. And because the Constitution, third, gives the federal government and the executive branch the ability to make treaties between countries, states have to follow national treaties. So, and this impacts Texas actually a good bit because we share a border with another nation, Mexico. And we do a lot of trade, a lot of migration back and forth on a daily basis between the two nations. And so Texas is, right, engaged in this practice of working with the nation of Mexico on a day-to-day basis. And from the federal perspective, generally the idea is do what you need to do, right, to be working and effective and efficient. We don't want to put any barriers in place we don't have to, especially economically, right, between citizens going across the border and economics happening between Texas and Mexico. But whenever we pass a law, whenever we have a treaty, that impacts that, those are going to be supreme. So the fact that we haven't said anything about that right now on a certain topic, y'all go about your business. But just be aware that at some time in the future, if we have to pass a national law or we have a new treaty with Mexico, that's going to carry the day, right? And so we see this especially in trade agreements between the U.S. and Mexico, right, or between the U.S. and Canada. Because we've got a lot of trade going back and forth across the border. And so those trade agreements, which are treaties in that sense, tell Texas what it can do, right? What it's allowed to do, and what processes are going to be in place when trade occurs across the border, right? Travel and imports and taxation and all those things. So Texas is allowed an autonomy there until it is either contrary to federal edicts or new federal law tells it to do something different. So that generally works, but it is evolving. Okay, yeah. So on the marijuana, this is an interesting and a good question on the federalism issue, right? So as you point out, Davin, that states have legalized pot, but other states haven't. And you say there's talk that the Fed's needing to change the laws. So here's the deal, right? The federal government is responsible for categorizing substances as legal or illegal. And if they're categorized as illegal, putting them into categories of schedules 1, 2, or whatever, or A or B or whatever. And those have different levels of control by the federal government on the whatever the substance is based on the category it's put in. So the federal government is saying marijuana is I think it's Schedule 1 drug or something like that, which is the highest level, subject to the most constraints by the federal government. And the federal government says it's illegal. No doubt about it, right? Federal government says it's illegal. States, right, and this has been something that states have done since the beginning of time in the U.S., quite often challenge federal mandates like that, federal rules, and make their own laws. Now, a state that passes a law saying we're going to legalize marijuana is fully cognizant of the fact that the federal government says that that's not the case. And they do it anyway. The federal government has to choose whether they come in and exercise that law within the state and make the state follow the federal procedures. Now, where the federal government has control through other means, they're still impacting the implementation of marijuana use laws in the states. Now, there's a little bit of a concern here. Let me back up real quick and show you why. Most of the time, historically speaking, states are responsible for social, family, or moral issues, meaning states determine how they enforce and what they do with drug laws. Now, the federal government has said we consider it illegal. The state may come along and say, well, we don't anymore, or we never have, right? And the state's going to have to figure out how they implement that without making the federal government come in and implement the federal law. So effectively what we've got right now are states are passing these marijuana laws which are contrary to federal law. And if the federal government decided to come in and force the states to follow federal law, they could. So far, they're not doing that, except in areas of financial institutions and monetary policy. And what they're really concerned about is that using federal banking institutions, federal savings and loans, all of these financial institutions, they don't want them to become fronts for laundering drug money, illegal drug money through the financial systems. And so you have folks who are running businesses legally by state law that really don't have federally insured places to put all the money they're making and to save and protect that money, because the federal government isn't allowing drug money to be deposited in those banks and stuff. Andrew.
Yeah, I got a bunch to say about that, I guess. I used to work in the cannabis industry in California, so I'm pretty familiar with all that type of stuff, especially the banking part. I can remember I worked at a dispensary in Roseville, California, which is near Sacramento, and it's a lot of gray area shit. It's like there's a lot of stuff that you're just kind of like, you have a piece of paper that says you're legally allowed to sell this product, right? And it's like it's an array of products, but it doesn't generalize what product, just says these products. So it's like very gray on that. And if you get pulled over, you're supposed to give them this little card that says you can sell it and they're going to let you go. But the whole time I'm carrying like thousands of dollars in cash because they can only pay me in cash. So it's like I'm carrying thousands of dollars in cash. You're not legally allowed to carry a gun on you if you have a medicinal marijuana card, which at this time it was medicinally legal, not recreational. And so you've got no protection on you. I was not robbed ever, but I know people that were robbed that worked for the same company as me. And it's just, and I can remember seeing the safe that my boss had that was just like, it had probably anywhere from 50 to 100 pounds of weed in it at any given time, and probably $50,000 to $100,000 of cash in it at any given time. And I don't know what he had doing with the other cash, but it was always like that. So it's an unbelievable amount of money. And the fact that they can't do anything with the banks, and I mean, it's starting to get a little bit different, I believe. I haven't been in California in a while, so I don't know what they're doing now with the laws. But if they really if they're going to do it nationally, which I hope they do, I'll show you.
Ruben had already.
Yeah, but they have to do something with it. It creates too much area for crime. It creates too much area because regardless of it, like, you're still laundering the money. It's just it's making it so that you can properly do it not without laundering. If they opened up banks to this, it wouldn't be laundering money. It would be correctly using money through a correct business, and a legal business that they're trying to make legal, at least through something that grows naturally out of the fucking ground. But whatever. That's my piece on it. Sorry about it.
Yeah, let's keep it more PG than R.
Sorry about that.
I know in normal conversation, a lot of times Samantha's giving you a talking to, right? So, yeah, I mean, this is the problems that we have, right? As we transition, because we see states that want to do different things. We see the federal government being subject to a broader policy perspective across the states. And you've got places like Texas that are, right, no, absolutely not, we're not doing it. And yet, if you look at what we're doing in Texas, we are starting to do some medicinal marijuana research, especially with CBD oil. Right, we've got some very targeted stuff happening as far as using it for epilepsy and brain seizures. The person in Texas that's focused on this, doing it in a particular way, is actually a registered nurse who is a representative out of North Central Texas. I want to say Fort Worth, right? And so she's the one that's looking at this, and is kind of, the legislature is kind of looking at her as the best combination of medical concern legislator. She's a conservative Republican, so that helps, other Republicans. And so she's kind of and I'm sorry I've forgotten her name at the moment. I listened to her speak for a while, and she's, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or conservative on the issue, she was incredibly well spoken, and she was incredibly knowledgeable about the subject, and she had just an enormous depth of different policy issues that she was having discussions with different legislators about as Texas starts to wrestle with this issue. And of course, if California and Texas and Florida and New York all end up going the same direction, we're going to drag the federal government probably with us, right? In a sense. And so there's a big deal. It's a big deal as each individual state decides to go one direction or the other, or how far they go here. And then you've got, just to drag us back right onto the slide here, you've got this 10th Amendment, which says powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution, nor prohibited to the states by the Constitution, are reserved to the states or the people. So to have federal drug laws and drug schedules on something that used to be almost entirely within the domain of the states leads us to question whether who's got the proper role here. And when we look at the 10th Amendment, we tend to think that maybe this federal oversight is maybe a little out of place. And we ought to let it be the wild, wild west as far as legislation goes, state by state by state. and we've had that before, right? We've had that as you look back at the history of marriage laws, right? State by state by state, they were all different. So it was an interesting kind of, you wanted to get married today, then you go to Las Vegas. Right, same-sex marriage, you at first could only go to Massachusetts, right? And so you had people, right, going to different venues for different social policies, and then bringing that back with them. So, well, there you go, Ruben. Andrew set you up. So, yeah, I mean, it's this is where it gets really interesting for us, thinking about federalism, right, and how this works for us. Now, how did we really establish national security? I mean, we have the stair-step of constitutional law, congressional law, and treaty that sets it up. But really, you look back at history, and we have historical moments that, because of the way they turned out and the decisions made at those times, have established this practice of national supremacy in certain areas. So we got 4 of these events I want to draw your attention to. Certainly something like marijuana will be one that will come in there. And so we'll see, we see these historical events becoming important over time. So let's talk about these first. First, we got, Mcculloch versus Maryland, which is a court case, Supreme Court case, and a fairly pivotal one, because it sets out some important prospects or ideas about what we should expect from government. So in this case, what you have is the U.S. Supreme Court trying to answer a practical question about how bank is allowed to work, but it's important because the impact of this bank's decision and the state law decision is going to fall squarely on federal actions because it's going to impact the federal bank. So basically what you had was U.S. Bank, right, led in a state. So you got a federal bank in the state of Maryland. Maryland had practices and laws in place that said, hey, all banks pay taxes in our state for the work that they're doing in our state. We make money off bank work. And second bank in the United States, you're in Maryland. And Maryland law applies to you. And Mcculloch, who was the representative of the federal system, is like, whoa, wait. This doesn't make sense to us, right? We're a federal bank. We're right working on issues for the national level of things. And it doesn't make sense for us as a bank that's set up by the federal government to work on federal banking issues to be taxed by a state, right? When we're not chartered in that state, we're not an institution of the state of Maryland, right? That came into existence. We're home to the federal government, and our laws are ours, and you shouldn't be able to impact us. And Maryland's like, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. You're the only one claiming to be an out-of-state bank, right? You're in our state, so our tax laws are going to apply to you. And so lawsuit, right? We have a discrepancy, a debate between a state law and a federal law, and the state government, the federal government, it's going to go to court to be settled. And so the Supreme Court is at the point of trying to make a decision here. And it's like, well, the federal government is making the claim off of a supremacy argument that federal bank, federal law, federal government has the right to have a bank. It has in the Constitution, right, bits and pieces that says that it's going to do things like coin money and have taxes. And so if we're doing these things, duh, a bank makes sense. And the state's going, nothing in the Constitution about a bank. Looks to me like right, y'all are kind of just trying to make this argument. It doesn't necessarily fly, right? If it's not written in the Constitution about a bank, then it's probably something that belongs to the state. And there's our argument, right? And so the Supreme Court eventually works through this and comes to the conclusion that there's this thing called the necessary and proper clause, sometimes referred to as the elastic clause. And that is the idea that the federal government will be able to do all the things necessary and proper to do what's in the Constitution, right? And while there's nothing that expressly says that the federal government shall have a bank, it's implied that a bank would be a pretty normal thing to have when you're coining money and needing to put it somewhere, and implementing taxes between the states and import taxes and things like. You're going to need a place for that. So a bank seems necessary and proper, and we're going to say that that's an implied power of the federal government. So that 10th Amendment telling us if it's not mentioned specifically, right, as a power of the federal government, it probably belongs to the state, is now debatable in a sense, right, from this implied powers doctrine and the necessary and proper clause. Yeah, so, the decision essentially out of this is that while the government might not have had a real clear legal basis for the bank, the implication of what the federal government was expected to do set it up that if it didn't have a bank, it probably couldn't do the coining of money and such, those constitutional powers that were mentioned. And so therefore it's implied that it's going to be there. Do you feel like I tortured that enough to get from point A to point Z? And I do that, I mean, that's intentional, right? Because this is really a stretching of trying to justify this kind of position and decision. So essentially, we move from a prescribed power, coin money, to an implied power, meaning create a bank, to this is a proper exercise of federal power, and states, you can't interfere with us, we're not paying your tax. And then it's going to be used, of course, historically, again and again and again. The federal government's going to say, well, yeah, you can't point out exactly where this is, but it's implied because, right? So it's the power of the federal government expands or contracts based upon, is elastic, based upon how we make these arguments. Again, it kind of does say if we should be able to kind of track it back to an enumerated power, right? One of those explicitly listed ones, but does this make sense? You got to remember that, as you're teasing these kind of things out, right? People write constitutions and laws, and they know what they mean when they write it about what they're thinking about. But once the legislation or the Constitution gets out there and it really encounters the real world, these historical decisions become very important because they're contextualizing, right, that law or that Constitution in a real grounded experience. And that's it may change it. It's different, right? And so having a historical event that kind of brings it all together and gets us a practical decision helps us understand a little bit of where this is going. The second historical event that helped establish national supremacy over the states is the interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Essentially, the Constitution says that the federal government shall have commerce powers on interstate commerce. In other words, commerce that goes on between the states. And that the states will have control over commerce that is intrastate commerce, right? It's commerce that happens inside the state boundaries only. When this commerce clause is written and it's kind of given some significance and some meaning, there's a pretty clear line of commerce crossing state lines, right, or not crossing state lines. You could look at it and see it happen easily, most cases. So it was a fairly clear delineation of commerce powers. That's not true anymore. And as the world has changed and as commerce has become broader and faster and international, this distinction between interstate commerce and intrastate commerce is much, much harder to find and put a finger on. Right? If we were in the classroom, and I can ask you to do this, I guess, in your where you are today, look around you and try to find one thing. You might be able to, but try to find one thing that has not crossed the state boundary that you own, that's in front of you. Certainly, if you made something yourself, you're probably on the right track. But then you got to look at what you used to make that thing and see what the provenance of those things were, right? And you might have a real hard time finding anything that you engage with on a daily basis that's not subject to interstate, that's not subject to interstate regulation. I am not going there, Davin. So, what initially was probably a pretty clear-cut and easily applicable definition is expanded. And when we get to the civil rights era, when we're seeing U.S. citizens not being afforded their rights in most of the southern states, and the federal government's looking for a way to come down into the states, especially the southern states, and try to make the states and the cities treat these U.S. citizens the same across the board, the Commerce Clause became a very effective way to do that, because you have businesses that are local in nature, own, sole proprietor, right, shop in their town and only in their town, saying whites only. And the federal government's like, how do we protect the citizens, the U.S. citizens' right to engage in commerce without being discriminated against? And the way they did it in a lot of instances was to look at all of the commerce going on in that privately owned business. And if they could determine that any of it was interstate commerce at all, that allowed them to come in and regulate, look, this, and this were all made here and brought over the state lines, or purchased from there and brought over the state lines. And therefore, we have the ability to regulate the commerce going on in this private drugstore, and you can't discriminate against U.S. citizens. So, right, that was definitely not the way it was initially perceived, but that's the way we've used it over history to try to make it a functional tool. I'm going to stop here for the day, and we'll come back and on Thursday and knock out the next 5 slides. Right, and so we'll pick up here on slide 9 with the last 2 historical events, and then finish this chapter off on Thursday. Any questions?
No, I think I'm good. Thank you, Professor. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too. See you all on Thursday. Have good days. Oh, Brandon, boy, you're asking me to remember a date. I think I still have the syllabus pulled up. Yes, I do. 4/16. Papers due on 4/16. Paper subject list, go to the main Blackboard page. Go down. Let me just, I'm hang around just for a second, and I'm going to share my screen with you, and I will show you where. Right. See what we get popping up here. That's not the right screen. It is in the syllabus, and I'm gonna get there. Stop that one. Share this one. Okay. So yeah, you're seeing this now. Go here to writing assignment. Click on that, and here's the directions. And if you come on down here to the bottom, there's the paper topics. There you go, Brandon and Samantha, right? So any of those topics you can use to write a paper. Have a good day, y'all. Oh, I'm sorry, Samantha, maybe it wasn't showing for me before. Oh, okay. Are you seeing it now? Okay, great. Isn't it amazing how when kids scream, it just shuts your eyes down? You can't see things. All you see is the screaming. Yep, it makes an impact, no doubt about it. Good luck with your twins. You did say you had twins, right? Yeah. Better you than me. Yeah. Have a good day.